Alright guys, Murphs here, and today, at viewer request, we're going to discuss different types of trigger systems and what the pros and cons are of each. Now, who is this video aimed at? This is aimed at the new shooter, somebody who's kind of taking their first steps into the firearms community, looking to get involved in guns and trying to figure out what features they should be valuing in different types of firearms and all that kind of stuff. Maybe they've already bought one and now they're looking to expand their horizons, or they're looking around for their first purchase. It doesn't really matter. Now, if you're that person, I actually published a video previously about taking your first steps in the firearms community. So if you're interested in that, check out the link in the description. One of the great things about the firearms industry right now is that we do not want for options. We can get whatever flavor it is that we want, whatever combination it is that we want. The problem is that we don't want for options, which means that there's a ton of things that we have to negotiate our way through, and there's tons of opinions, and you know, this person says this and this person says that, and the guy down the street said this, and the gun shop owner told me I should do this, and all that kind of stuff. It can be very difficult to negotiate this path. The purpose of this video is to focus in on a single feature or aspect of firearms and contextually discuss what the pros and cons are. I'm not telling you what it is that you should get. I have my own opinions. I know what the kind of like leading industry opinion is and all that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, I'm not trying to make my preference your problem. But I do want to give you the context that you need in order to be able to make the best and most informed decision that you can, and throw a little bit of my preference in there as proof that I am willing to kind of take ownership of what it is that I believe, I guess you could say. So at the end of the day, there's no wrong answer here. Now, you can put together a couple of answers that might make a poor system, but even mistakes like that can be rectified and better focused in order to be able to still get the best that you can out of whatever it is that you're trying to employ. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and identify the terms that we're going to be using today. We're going to be talking about single action triggers, double action triggers, double action single action or DASA, and striker fired systems. All right, so now that we've identified the terms, why don't we go ahead and define them. A single action trigger is a trigger that performs one action. You're welcome for that. Thanks, Websters. So, what do I mean by that? In a single action design, you have a hammer and a firing pin and a trigger. The trigger releases the hammer to strike the firing pin, and that's all that it does. That hammer, one way or another, has to get recocked. Now, whenever we think of single action systems in these terms, we most often think of revolvers, like this Ruger Blackhawk Liberty Edition, previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. So, I cock the hammer, as you can see there, hammer's cocked back. I pull the trigger, and if I attempt to pull the trigger again, I cannot fire the gun until I cock the hammer and then pull the trigger. So, that is a single action in revolver format. What about in semi-autos? Well, for that, we have to look at this Browning High Power Mark III to get our instance of that. So as you can see, my hammer's back. I pull my trigger. I cycle the slide, and now my hammer's back again so I can pull the trigger. And that will continue as long as I have rounds in the gun. The slide will continue the cycle, and we'll continue to cock that hammer back so that the trigger can do the only thing it's supposed to do, which is release the hammer to impinge the firing pin, or to act upon the firing pin to impinge the bullet's primer. So this will continue to happen until I either run out of bullets or I empty the gun and lower the hammer safely. So there's our single action. Let's talk about double action. Double action is when the trigger performs two actions. It cocks and releases the hammer. You do not manually cock the hammer in this case. the cycle of the trigger does so. Now, what's important to remember is that as the trigger cycles, if you stop pulling that double action trigger, everything goes back to its original position. It's not going to stay in like a half-cocked position up until you come back and finish it. So in the case of revolvers, we look at this Smith & Wesson Model 642. I have no exposed hammer. As we can see there, I was able to pull the trigger. I had nothing that on the outside of this gun that I had to manually activate in order to be able to continue to pull the trigger. That is how a double action gun works in a revolver. In a semi-auto, we wind up coming to this this Sig P226 double action Kellerman, which was actually the first gun I ever reviewed on the channel. Link in the description. So for this gun, you'll see that we have a bobbed hammer, though it doesn't matter whether or not the hammer is bobbed. That does not indicate one way or the other as to whether or not this is a double action only gun. It's the trigger system that entirely falls on. So, as you can see here, I've started to pull the trigger, the hammer's coming back, I stop, well, in that case I pulled all the way through, but I start to, the hammer comes back, and when I release, the hammer falls and the trigger moves forward. Then, as I want to shoot it, I can continue to pull that trigger as long as I want, regardless of whether or not there's ammunition in the gun. The action of the trigger is what cocks the hammer in that case. All right, so that's double action. Now let's get into double action, single action. This is a trigger that can perform two different functions. It fires in double action and it can be fired in single action. That's different depending on what type of weapon system it is that you're looking at. So in the case of a revolver like the Smith & Wesson Model 36, this gun defaults to being a double action. You see here, I pull the trigger. The hammer and trigger cycle and continually cycle, all that kind of stuff. It is a double action gun. However, if for some reason I want to take a more precise shot, or my finger's getting tired, I'm tired of pulling the trigger on double action, I can then cock the hammer back, and now I have a single action gun. But as soon as I shoot it, the gun goes back to being double action. That changes things in a semi-auto, like in this Sig M11A1. So here, with this, we'll leave the magazine out for this. With this, the gun defaults to being a double action only because I don't have ammunition in the gun right now. But if I had a bullet in the gun, my first round would be double action. Then the slide would cycle, and I would now have a single action trigger for all my subsequent shots up until which time that I either ran out of ammunition or I hit my decocker and drop the hammer. So now we go back to a double action type setup. If I fire the gun, I will be in single action yet again. Okay, so that is our DASA type setup. What is striker fired? Striker fired is actually very interesting because it's a very old trigger system. It's older than what most people would actually give it credit for. Striker fired was in bolt action rifles long before it was in handguns, and then was actually part of some early handgun designs. Kind of came in and out over the years up until the 1980s when there was a big boom of striker fired guns with the introduction of the Glock, and then everybody who's parodied a Glock ever since then. A striker fired system is a completely self-contained system around the firing pin. It is a firing pin under spring tension with a positive block that the trigger, the movement of the trigger, removes said block, allowing the striker to go home and impinge the primer, send the bullet downrange, all that kind of stuff. Classically, the striker is at full cock. In more modern sense, the striker is not fully cocked. It's like, 80%, something like that. And then the movement of the trigger cocks it the rest of the way and then removes the positive block, allowing that striker to go home. And this is very common in striker fired guns like this Glock 41. There's not a lot to see because pretty much everything's happening inside of the gun. But, well, we'll talk about attributes here after a little bit when we get into the pros and cons. Now, I remember when I was a kid, I was looking through like my gun magazines and books and all this kind of stuff. I used to have tons of these things, catalogs and all that kind of stuff. And I ran across something that identified a Glock as being a double action trigger. And that didn't make any sense to me because, well, I don't get a second strike capability out of a Glock like I do. Like I can't pull the trigger again. Yet we saw in the double action, I could pull that trigger over and over and over again. It's referred to in this case as a double action trigger because the movement of the trigger does cock the striker the rest of the way. So by definition and terminology, that is a double action trigger. It just happens to have some single action type features with not being able to have a second strike capability, which we're going to talk about that more here after a little bit. All right, so there's our definitions. Why don't we go ahead and get into the pros and cons of each of these, starting off with our single action triggers. The great thing about a single action trigger is that a good single action trigger is going to be better than the vast majority of striker fired triggers out on the market. The release is the travel, the release, the reset, all those types of things are better set up, and really it's going to be better than any of the double action guns, of course, because we have a shorter travel, a shorter reset, all that kind of stuff. These triggers better suit for precise type shooting. That's why you see a lot of single action triggers on competition guns and all that kind of stuff. They readily lend themselves to being very crisp, clean, no staginess, no sponginess, any of that kind of stuff. Now, my example here today in the Browning High Power is not necessarily the best, but I don't really have a lot of I don't really have any good single action triggers. But we can see here with a single action trigger, my hammer's already cocked back. I get rid of my take up, I get on the wall. I have a very defined wall. Like for sure, I know that if I put any more pressure on this trigger, this gun's gonna go off. So as we can see there, I've dropped the hammer. And when it comes to reset, this, and like I say, this is not the best single action trigger out there on the market, but even still, that was fairly short travel for reset. And then I'm right back on that wall. Like those are the things that I expect out of single action triggers, that I'm gonna have a very short amount of take up to get back onto the wall, which has its advantages for sure. Now, kind of a middle ground advantage, it's not a pro or a con, depending on, other things that you're looking for in firearms. Your single action semi-autos are going to come with some type of manual safety. As we can see here on this Mark III, I have a thumb safety. Your 1911s and their variants are going to have some type of thumb safety, all that kind of stuff. You might have grips, passive safety options incorporated as well, be it some sort of firing pin safety or grip safety or something along those lines. But you're most likely going to have some type of manual external safety that you have to the feet. Now, this is not a discussion about the pros and cons of different types of firearms safety features. That's actually a video that's coming up. I've been getting a lot of requests lately, so it keeps bumping that video back in the queue. But if you subscribe and go ahead and turn notifications on, if you're interested in that subject, you'll be the first to know when it gets posted. So there's our kind of middle ground when it comes to the single action triggers. What's the negative? In my opinion, the issue with single action triggers is that they can become too light, especially if you're talking about it for defensive type purposes. So if we're talking about like revolvers, it's not even necessarily just paired to the fact that the trigger pull is lighter and this gun is just kind of like ready to go. As much as if I, for whatever reason, don't hit that first shot, I've now got to take the time to manually cock the hammer and then get my sights back on target and all that kind of stuff. It's not impossible, but there's a lot of movement involved in manually cocking a revolver. That will disturb your sights. It'll slow down your engagement, and that's a problem if you already missed a shot. With semi-autos, my overall concern is just when you have a trigger that's too light or a reset that's too short and somebody's not necessarily had sufficient training in order to be able to accommodate that. Now, there's two things that comes with this. First off, training is always important. You're never going to away from that. You have to train around your firearm. The second here, some people attribute safety to triggers, and I do not think that is a good practice. I attribute surety to triggers. So someone's saying, well, that gun's unsafe because it has a really light trigger and I might inadvertently shoot somebody. Okay, well, you shouldn't be pointing a gun at anything that you're not willing to kill to begin with. That's basic firearms safe handling fundamentals do not go away just because you put a gun in your hand. In fact, they apply more than ever. Just because you're in a self-defense situation, in fact, they apply more than ever. You have to be sure of your target and beyond and all that kind of stuff before you even put a finger in the trigger guard. All of that is laid out in our firearms handling fundamentals. So if you're not sure that you're about to shoot, if you're not sure that somebody in front of you is a threat, you probably shouldn't be on the trigger. The surety aspect of it is that as I engage that target, as I have made the decision to engage that target and I continue to do so, I'm not going to have shots break prematurely before my sights have resettled or anything along those lines, because I've come off the wall or I've gotten right back on the wall and I'm trying to resettle my sights, but you know, my adrenaline's pumping and I twitched a little bit and the gun went off and now I have a round that has gone somewhere and has potentially killed somebody else, turning this justified shoot into a murder investigation. Yes, those are things that you might want to take into account with this type of thing. You can have a trigger that is too light and may compromise your surety in your engagement. So that is my own, I don't think I've really heard anyone else necessarily use this term. This is how I think about it. All right, that's enough about our single action triggers. Oh, well, actually one more thing with single action triggers. You also have a very consistent engagement. You don't have two different trigger pulls that you have to like understand, and then also you have a lighter trigger pull to work around, and that's going to play more in this conversation as we move forward. But we also don't necessarily have a second strike capability, which we'll talk about that more here in just a second. I keep like dropping the second strike thing and haven't really fully explained it. We'll get into it here in just a moment. All right, so that's single action triggers. Why don't we go ahead and talk about double action? All right. The great thing about a double action is that surety thing yet again. I am not going to inadvertently break a shot before I intend to do so. However, there's a lot that comes with that. First off, training long-term with double action only triggers can be very exhausting. Double action triggers in general can be very exhausting. So if your hand strength's not quite where you need it to be, you should probably not be looking at these systems, or start doing some stuff to increase your grip strength and hand strength and all that kind of stuff, which isn't a bad thing either. But it could be detrimental to your training process, and that's a big issue here. In addition to that, double action triggers are long. They can be very stagey. It can be difficult to find a wall and all that kind of stuff. And honestly, with how I shoot like double action revolvers, I don't really necessarily pay attention to the wall as much as I get into a rhythm and pattern with how my sights are moving and all that kind of stuff. So, and that's really what I would kind of endorse more of. There's a lot of discussion about the wall, and I think the wall is more applicable to single action or striker fire triggers than it is to double action to some extent. There's maybe a whole separate discussion and topic there all by itself. So, these sights are going to move a lot. And it's going to take a lot of training to be able to get that rhythm down and recoil management and all that kind of stuff in order to be able to consistently engage that target over and over again and have good hits and not have shots go wild. So it's great that like you are not going to accidentally break a shot before you get on target, but you might have a lot of issue getting the sights aligned for your multi-shot engagement, which is what you should be training towards anyway. It's great that in the movies there's like one shot stops and all that kind of stuff, but the reality is it doesn't always work out that way, and it's better to train for the worst case scenario with that. Now, what is the second strike capability that you keep referencing here, Murph? Well, let's say that you're out there and you're firing your gun and you pull the trigger and you get a click, no bang. You could theoretically pull the trigger one more time and get another opportunity to make sure that that primer is in fact dead. But I think in the current landscape, that is no longer relevant, because what pretty much everyone's training is if for whatever reason your gun doesn't shoot, tap, rack, bang. Get that bullet out of there. If it winds up being a bad primer or something along those lines, it's better to just go ahead and get rid of it instead of having 2 wasted trigger pulls that have not increased, that have not positively impacted the overall situation. In fact, you're just sitting there with a gun making the wrong noises. It's not going bang. It's not improving the overall situation by making your opponent dead. It's actually making it more possible that you're about to be dead. Now, when it comes to double action only trigger systems and semi-autos, we actually have a couple. We have the double action Kellerman here, and then we also have the HK LEM. Both of these guns have surprisingly smooth double action triggers. Like this double action Kellerman, I would love to have this smooth of a trigger in a double action revolver. It really does feel like it's on bearings. The LEM trigger is even better. The HK law enforcement modification, if I remember correctly, that is an even better trigger, for sure. Those I would not consider to be a detriment to your engagements in the same way that like a revolver double action trigger can be, but they are still going to require some training. One of the great things for some people when it comes to a double action trigger is that you have, with that heavy trigger pull, it's less likely that little fingers are going to be able to make their way into the trigger guard and cause accidents, cause major problems for themselves or other people around them. Again, safety does not come down to a trigger. If we're at the point of being on the trigger, we are moving past safety. The firearm is now dangerous because, well, I mean, firearms are always loaded and all that kind of stuff, but we're actively looking to use the firearm at that point. So safety takes on a different meaning once we get onto the trigger. There are other safety measures that should be put in place to make sure that little hands don't necessarily get a hold of firearms, but I could understand someone valuing that because it is kind of like a last-ditch effort. It's the last line of defense should that situation occur, and I can appreciate that as a measure. So double action, second strike capability, not necessarily a pro in this case. You're much better just going ahead and clearing that round and getting back into the fight with something that's going to work. The biggest issue with double actions is going to be manipulating that trigger and being able to do so consistently. And a lot of people say, well, it just comes down to training, Guys, we can train anything into efficiency. The question is, how long is it going to take? How much effort, how much ammunition is it going to take to get to that point of efficiency? If you're somebody who doesn't have a lot of time, doesn't necessarily have a lot of money to throw at the hobby and all that kind of stuff, you may not be able to take the time necessary to be able to train around that double action gun. Or any of the, or different, as we go through this conversation overall, those are things that you have to keep in mind. So there is a certain amount of utility involved in having something that lends itself easily to training. Okay, so that was our discussion on double action. Let's go ahead and get into our DASA. The great thing about double action guns is that you can carry the gun hammer down. You don't necessarily need to have a manual safety, though there are DASA guns out there with manual safeties. You can carry it hammer down in a relatively safe condition, round in the chamber, all that kind of stuff. Have that surety with your first trigger pull, and then have a lighter, easier to work with single action trigger to follow up with it. So, of course here, and this is really not a fair comparison because this is actually Sig's SRT trigger, if I remember correctly. But regardless, we have this double action take up, then the release, our slide cycles, and now it's a super short, like we're pretty much right back on the wall as soon as this thing resets. And it's very light, very easy trigger pull, a little bit of over travel, but not bad overall, as opposed to our just straight double action trigger where I've got take up, take up, take up, take up, take up, and then I pretty much power through the wall. Like there's not much of a defined wall in the DAK. Like literally about the time that I think I'm on the wall, like right there, there's our release. That is handy in theory. The issue with the double action, single action transition is that, especially for new shooters, that first double action shot might go wild because they're still trying to figure out how to like keep track of their sights and all that kind of stuff. And then their follow-up single action shot will also go a little wide because, well, they were preparing to come back onto this heavy double action pull, and they actually wound up with a lighter pull, which caused them to mess that up. The problem with the training aspect, the training excuse that's so frequently used when it comes to a wide variety of things in the firearms community, is that that's actually really difficult to train with a DASA gun. Like, I'm a big proponent of dry fire practice. I spend a lot of time on dry fire practice. But you eventually have to replace dry fire practice with live fire. Incorporating recoil and malfunction clearance and all that kind of stuff are necessary aspects of firearms training. You do not, I know guys who are like, I don't practice, I don't go to the range and shoot my handgun. I just dry fire practice at home all the time. And I'm telling you right now, they are setting themselves up for failure. You have to put this gun under recoil at some point. The problem with trying to practice DASA during dry fire practice is, cool, I got this single action trigger and then I cycle the slide. That action there that I just did disconnected the difference in trigger, because there's time built in there. There's time for my brain to adapt to what it is that just changed and know that now I'm working with a single action trigger. Whereas if you put these guns under recoil and you're trying to do like a multi-shot string, that just a couple of seconds there is very different than the microseconds that you have from first trigger pull to second trigger pull under recoil. That is where the metal meets the meat on training when it comes to DASA guns. You have to work around that, or you will never improve. Now, when it comes to revolvers, of course, we're primarily stuck with the double action trigger, which is going to be quite heavy, and you get back to the same issues with double action only guns where you have to learn how to manage your sights and all that kind of stuff and get your trigger stroke and your rhythm and all that kind of stuff in order to be able to effectively place multiple shots on a target. So then some people are like, well, just shoot it single action. Well, there's a couple of things, especially when you're talking about small guns like this, like my 1 7/8 inch Smith & Wesson Model 36 moves around in my hand. Like, there's not a lot of grip. This has way more grip than the 1 7/8 inch gun does. So trying to break my grip to cock the hammer and then get back onto the gun could potentially have me throw a shot wide. That's why you got to be really careful with single action triggers, especially in high stress situations. So something to keep in mind. Like, I see a lot of people with double action guns that only shoot them single action, and they're defensive guns. You need to learn how to run a double action on a revolver if you're going to carry a double action revolver. And you need to not depend on single action triggers. It's a personal gripe there, but it is the reality of the matter. Like, this is what you should be training around. This trigger here, which, as we can see, long. We don't have a defined wall necessarily. We have an area where I'm fairly certain that it's about to break. Yeah, see right about there. And then our resets all the way out here. Single action, very short. Little bit of take up, and then we're on like a thin wall and then a break. Those are things that you have to keep in mind whenever it is that you're talking about trying to carry these types of guns defensively. All right, our striker fired. So with striker fired triggers, just like with single action triggers, we have that consistent trigger pull. It's going to be the same every time, and that is very helpful whenever it is that you're talking about economy of training. You've got the same trigger when you dry fire practice with it, it's always going to be the same. When you live fire with it, it's always going to be the same. Your walls and all that kind of stuff are going to be in predictable areas. It never changes. There's a lot of utility involved in that, for sure. So, you can see here, Glock's very popular handguns, so start to pull. Get on my wall. Now, of course, Lots of people complain about Glock triggers. There are better striker fire triggers out there, but you're always going to have a little bit of sponginess, a little bit of grittiness. You're going to have to kind of grind your way through the wall. Whereas with the single action trigger, it was very much so more crisp. There was a very definitive wall, and then you pulled the rest of the way through it and released the hammer. This is not necessarily the same. Now, a reset puts me a little bit ahead of the wall. And that's not unusual in striker fire triggers. That's something to keep in mind there. So, yes, it's a consistent trigger. It's just not a particularly good consistent trigger, depending on the trigger it is that you're using. There's a lot of things that impact that. But as a whole, striker fire triggers are not going to feel as good as single action triggers. Is that detrimental? No, there's a reason that police and military all around the world use striker-fired handguns, especially because you get a lot of economy in size. This gun is able to be much smaller, much slimmer, lower profile slide and all that kind of stuff because the system doesn't require so many moving parts. It's a very efficient system from a design standpoint, which doesn't play as much into the shooting, well, it does play into the shooting portion, but doesn't play very much into the trigger portion of this discussion. Now, some people might also cite some inherent issues with safety involved with striker-fired handguns because you do have a firing pin under spring tension. That's why a lot of modern guns do not have the striker all the way cocked back. However, it is still partially cocked. This gets into the whole passive safety discussion, which is just not really what we're getting into right now. So keep on the lookout for that video coming up, hopefully before too much longer. All right. So there's our pros and cons of each one of these systems. What are my recommendations when it comes to selecting what type of trigger system you want to go with? Well, as I previously mentioned, the overarching idea here is that there is not a wrong answer. The only question I would ask you is how much time and money do you have to dedicate to training? Or is this going to be more like your gym membership that you have and, you know, you went for the first like 2 weeks of the new year and then you were like, man, but I got this other stuff going on. I'll go tomorrow. I'll go tomorrow, and tomorrow never comes. If that's the situation, which is the reality for an awful lot of people, I understand, like, life happens. People have lots of things going on. I'm just happy you're armed, but I would like to see you train more. Just keep that in mind. The conventional wisdom is to go with a consistent trigger pull. So to either go with a consistent light trigger pull. So to either go with the single action or to go with a striker fired gun. The vast majority of people in the industry are going to drive you towards a striker fired gun of some sort because there are so many options. But single action guns would also be indicative of that same type of thing, of having that consistent trigger pull. When we're talking, and we're primarily talking about semi-autos, I would not necessarily recommend that your average new shooter go after a double action only gun. I would not even recommend that your average new shooter go after a revolver. There's a lot of people out there who voice that opinion as well. We have a revolver versus semi-auto discussion. I'll throw the link in the description to that as well. But with that double action trigger, revolvers are going to be inherently more difficult for somebody to learn how to shoot, and it's also going to be maybe a little bit more challenging to their grip strength and all that kind of stuff. So something like Glocks or the high power, something along those lines, you know, if you've got a ton of money that you just feel like setting on fire, going with, you know, some type of you know, Springfield Prodigy or anything along those 2011 type systems, whatever it is that you may be looking for, there's a ton of options in the single action market. 1911s, if you're, you know, feeling nostalgic, something along those lines. And then, of course, PDPs, Smith & Wesson MMPs, all that kind of stuff. The whole striker fire market is very open to you. If you're just looking at it from a trigger standpoint. Now, if you're concerned about other things like surety or making sure that little fingers don't get in the trigger guard and all that kind of stuff, then something like an HK LEM or a double action Kellerman system, let alone a DASA gun, may be something that's very important to you. at that point now costs and other features of the handgun become more important than just the trigger system. And that's when, keep in mind guys, we are hyper focusing on triggers. We're not talking about grips. We're not talking about the placement of safeties or magazine releases, slide releases, any of those types of things. None of that's what's being discussed right now. We are solely talking about one portion of the gun to help feed into the overall discussion, the overall implications that you're involved in when you're trying to decide your first or next handgun purchase. So I could see, and that's another aspect of conventional wisdom. Well, you go with the double action trigger, and then if, your kid gets a hold of it, they're less likely to be able to set it off. That's only going to work for so long, so it's definitely not a long-term solution. You need to come up with, first off, firearms education for your children to make sure that they understand that this is not a toy, and then also proper storage techniques so that they don't have access to these things. It's a very important thing to keep in mind. So that's kind of following the industry line on things. What were my choices when I was first getting involved in the shooting, in developing my own collection and preparing myself for my own defense and all that kind of stuff? When I was a kid, I was a huge fan of single action guns, like the 1911, like the high power. That's why this gun is in my collection to begin with. When I was much younger, I wanted that consistent trigger pull, and I wanted a lighter first trigger pull because your first shot in a gunfight's your most important. If you can go ahead and start putting hits on them right off the bat, then you're changing the formula in your favor. And I still believe that to be true. However, I've spent a lot of time training around double action guns and revolvers. Pretty much all of these I have spent a lot of time training around. This thing's absolutely miserable to shoot, but like the Smith & Wesson Model 36, I carry this quite a bit. I shoot this quite a bit. I am very confident in this firearm and my ability to be able to stack hits with it. I train and shoot all of these systems and feel very confident in being able to defend myself with all of these systems. I feel no limitations. I don't feel held back by any of them. I shoot a lot. I shoot every weekend. I run a YouTube channel. I compete. I collect firearms. I have an interest. This is my interest. This is my hobby. This is my passion. Somebody who doesn't have the time, energy, and resources to dedicate to this would probably want to stick with my original idea of like making sure that my first shot's on target, having, the consistent trigger pull and all that kind of stuff. When I introduce new shooters, to over a period of time to a variety of handguns and action types because I want them to be able to develop their own opinions. The most recent shooter that I introduced has decided that they absolutely love DASA guns. And that's because we've spent a lot of time working around DASA guns. That doesn't mean that they don't value striker-fired guns for their consistency and all that kind of stuff, but they don't feel inhibited by a DASA transition. That's pretty cool. And that's not the expected norm. But if you're a person who is introducing new shooters to the shooting sports and all that kind of stuff, that is something to consider, especially since you should really give them the opportunity to be able to sample other things. And it's the same thing, instructors will say that kind of stuff all the time. And if you're an instructor who doesn't take the time to learn these other types of trigger systems, I'm a little disappointed in you, if I'm being completely honest, because at the end of the day, your student may come to you with something like a Smith & Wesson Model 642, and you should still be able to adequately instruct them in its use. It may not be your cup of tea, but you should still know how to go through an engagement with a revolver, how to conduct reloads, all that kind of stuff. I'm getting off on a little bit of a rabbit hole here, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop myself, guys. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope that this has helped somebody in their quest for their first or next gun purchase. And that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.